Most people think their problem with Bitcoin is timing. They believe they arrived too late, bought too high, sold too early, or missed the one perfect moment that would have changed everything. But timing is not the real issue. The real problem runs much deeper, and it begins with how people mentally frame Bitcoin before they ever own a single Satoshi. From the very beginning, Bitcoin is often treated like a lottery ticket disguised as technology. People hear stories of overnight millionaires, explosive bull runs, and life changing gains compressed into short periods of time. So naturally, they approach Bitcoin with the same mindset they would bring to a casino table or a high risk stock trade. They look for entry points, exit points, signals, predictions, influencers, and promises. They ask when to buy, when to sell, and how much profit they can squeeze out of the next move. This mindset quietly sets them up for failure because when Bitcoin is reduced to a price chart, everything becomes emotional. Green candles feel like validation. Red candles feel like punishment. Every dip triggers fear. Every pump triggers greed. And the individual slowly becomes a hostage to volatility. Instead of owning Bitcoin, they feel like Bitcoin owns them. Their mood, confidence, and sense of intelligence rise and fall with the market. What almost no one tells you early on is that Bitcoin does not reward excitement. It rewards clarity. Bitcoin was not created to be exciting. It was created to be reliable. It does not promise comfort in the short term, and it does not care about your personal timeline. It simply exists as a system with fixed rules, running relentlessly, block after block, regardless of human emotion. The tragedy is that most people encounter Bitcoin through noise rather than understanding, so they never pause long enough to ask what problem it was actually designed to solve. At its core, Bitcoin is not an investment product competing for your attention. It is a response to a monetary system that leaks value over time. It is an alternative to money that requires trust in institutions, constant expansion, and silent debasement. When viewed through that lens, the idea of buying Bitcoin already feels slightly wrong. You are not purchasing a speculative asset. You are exchanging one form of value for another, and the quality of that exchange depends entirely on time. This is where the first major misunderstanding appears. People believe risk in Bitcoin comes from volatility. In reality, volatility is just movement. Risk comes from misunderstanding what you own. Someone who buys Bitcoin expecting quick profits experiences every downturn as danger. Someone who understands Bitcoin as long-term monetary insulation experiences downturns as noise. The difference is not intelligence. It is orientation. Speculators focus on price because price is all they see. Accumulators focus on scarcity because scarcity is what gives price meaning in the first place. Bitcoin's supply does not respond to demand. It does not adjust itself to human desire. No committee can decide to print more because times are hard. This single feature alone places Bitcoin in a category most people are not psychologically prepared for, because it removes the comforting illusion that someone is in control. And when people feel out of control, they react. This is why the majority of Bitcoin participants end up doing the opposite of what benefits them. They buy when they feel safe and sell when they feel afraid. They chase momentum and flee uncertainty. They tell themselves stories about being rational, but their actions reveal a deeper truth. They are not engaging with Bitcoin. They are reacting to it. Accumulation, however, requires something radically different. It requires the willingness to step outside the emotional rhythm of the market and adopt the rhythm of time itself. It asks you to accept that there is no perfect moment, no guaranteed outcome, and no authority figure who can reassure you when things feel uncomfortable. This is deeply countercultural. Modern financial culture trains people to believe that wealth is built through cleverness, speed, and constant optimization. Bitcoin quietly undermines that belief. It suggests that patience can outperform intelligence, that consistency can outperform timing, and that humility can outperform confidence. For many, this is an uncomfortable message because it strips away the fantasy of being smarter than everyone else. So before we talk about strategies, schedules, or methods, there is a more important shift that must occur. Bitcoin accumulation is not about winning. It is about positioning. It is not about predicting the future, but about preparing for it. And preparation does not begin with charts or models. It begins with redefining what you consider success. If your definition of success is beating the market, Bitcoin will torment you. If your definition of success is preserving purchasing power across decades, Bitcoin starts to make sense. The same asset, the same price movements, but a completely different internal experience. This is why so many people say Bitcoin is stressful, while others say it is peaceful. The difference is not the market. The difference is the story they are telling themselves. Until that story changes, no accumulation method will ever feel right. Every plan will collapse under pressure. Every downturn will feel personal. And Bitcoin, instead of becoming a tool for long-term stability, will remain a source of anxiety. The best way to accumulate Bitcoin does not begin with buying. It begins with understanding what you are actually doing when you exchange today's money for tomorrow's certainty. Once the emotional fog around Bitcoin begins to lift, a subtle but powerful realization emerges. The question is no longer when to buy, but how to position yourself over time. This shift may seem small on the surface, but it changes everything. Because Bitcoin was never meant to be acquired in a single decisive moment, it was meant to be grown into, slowly, deliberately, almost quietly. Most financial assets encourage urgency. Stocks reward early entry and aggressive timing. Real estate celebrates leverage and speed. Bitcoin does the opposite. It rewards those who respect duration. It favors people who are willing to let ownership accumulate the way understanding does, piece by piece, through experience rather than prediction. This is why the language of buying Bitcoin is misleading. Buying implies a transaction that ends. Accumulating implies a process that continues. One is an event, the other is a relationship. And Bitcoin, more than almost any other asset, reveals the quality of your relationship with time. Bitcoin's scarcity is often discussed, but rarely internalized. 21 million is not just a number. It is a hard boundary in a world built on soft promises. Everything else in modern finance expands when pressure appears. Bitcoin contracts emotionally when pressure appears because its supply refuses to cooperate with human need. That refusal is not a flaw. It is the entire point. When you begin to see Bitcoin this way, ownership stops feeling like a trade and starts feeling like alignment. You are not trying to outsmart the system. You are opting out of a system that demands constant vigilance just to stand still. Inflation forces you to run faster every year just to preserve what you already earned. Bitcoin offers a different proposition. Slow down, think longer, and let time do the heavy lifting. This is where accumulation becomes a habit rather than a strategy. Habits do not require constant decision-making. They remove friction from consistency. People who succeed at accumulating Bitcoin rarely wake up asking whether today is a good day to buy. They have already decided that converting a portion of their surplus energy into Bitcoin is simply part of how they operate in the world. The emotional debate has ended. What remains is execution. This is deeply uncomfortable for people trained to believe that financial success comes from action and reaction. Accumulation asks you to be boring. It asks you to accept that the most powerful moves are often the least dramatic. Over time, this boredom compounds into clarity. You stop checking the price obsessively because price becomes less relevant than position. You measure progress in ownership, not in temporary valuation. And this is where psychological stability begins to appear. When Bitcoin is viewed as a long-term monetary asset rather than a speculative vehicle, volatility loses much of its power. Price drops no longer feel like failure. They feel like fluctuations in exchange rates between two forms of money, one inflating by design and one fixed by code. In that context, the question is not whether Bitcoin is risky, but whether holding depreciating currency indefinitely is risk-free. Most people never ask that question because they are conditioned not to. They assume that what is familiar is safe and what is volatile is dangerous. Bitcoin inverts that intuition. It is volatile precisely because it is discovering its place in the global monetary landscape. The volatility is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of adoption colliding with scarcity. Understanding this changes your emotional posture. Instead of feeling exposed, you feel anchored. Instead of fearing drawdowns, you see them as temporary discounts on a long-term reallocation of value. This does not require blind faith. It requires intellectual honesty about how monetary systems behave over decades, not days. Accumulating Bitcoin, then, is less about believing in price appreciation and more about recognizing monetary degradation elsewhere. It is a response, not a gamble. You are not betting that Bitcoin will succeed. You are hedging against the certainty that fiat currencies will continue to lose purchasing power slowly and relentlessly, as they always have. This is why people who truly accumulate Bitcoin rarely talk about it loudly. The process is quiet. It does not offer instant validation. There are no trophies for patience, no applause for restraint. In a culture obsessed with immediacy, choosing to accumulate Bitcoin is an act of delayed gratification so extreme that it borders on rebellion. And yet, this is precisely why it works. Because while others are chasing moments, accumulators are building position. While others are reacting to headlines, accumulators are responding to fundamentals. While others are trying to be right, accumulators are trying to be resilient. The moment you stop asking how to make money with Bitcoin and start asking how to store value through Bitcoin, the entire experience changes. Anxiety gives way to intention. Noise fades into background, and ownership stops feeling fragile. Bitcoin does not need your excitement. It needs your patience. And patience, when paired with a scarce asset that cannot be diluted, has a way of turning small, consistent actions into something far larger than they appear in the moment. Once Bitcoin is understood as a long-term monetary asset rather than a short-term opportunity, the question naturally shifts again. It is no longer about conviction, and it is no longer about belief. It becomes a practical question of sustainability. How do you accumulate Bitcoin in a way that does not exhaust you mentally, financially, or emotionally over the course of many years? The uncomfortable truth is that most accumulation plans fail not because they are mathematically flawed, but because they are psychologically incompatible with real life. They demand too much attention, too much emotional bandwidth, or too much sacrifice all at once. They work beautifully on paper and collapse quietly in practice. Sustainability begins with accepting a simple limitation. You are not a machine. You have obligations, changing income, unpredictable expenses, and emotional cycles that cannot be optimized away. Any accumulation approach that assumes perfect discipline or constant certainty will eventually break. The most resilient strategy is the one that bends with life rather than resisting it. This is why consistency outperforms intensity over long periods of time. People often assume that the best Bitcoin accumulators are the most aggressive ones, those who allocate heavily, buy dips with precision, and move decisively during moments of fear. In reality, the most successful accumulators tend to be remarkably unremarkable. They do not rely on moments of courage. They rely on systems that function even when motivation is low. A sustainable accumulation rhythm is one that integrates Bitcoin into your financial life without turning it into the center of your identity. Bitcoin should not require constant monitoring or emotional justification. It should feel like a quiet, ongoing exchange of excess value into something harder, something more durable. This requires an honest relationship with your income and expenses. Accumulation is only possible when there is surplus. Trying to accumulate Bitcoin while living at the edge of financial stress introduces fragility. Every market downturn becomes a threat because liquidity is needed for survival rather than long-term positioning. In contrast, when accumulation is built on true surplus, volatility loses its urgency. You are no longer forced to react. This is one of the least discussed aspects of Bitcoin accumulation, the discipline of lifestyle design. People who accumulate successfully often do so not because they earn extraordinary amounts, but because they control outflows with intention. They understand that every unit of currency they do not waste is a unit of optionality they can redirect toward long-term ownership. This does not mean living ascetically or denying yourself joy. It means recognizing the difference between consumption that enriches your life and consumption that merely distracts you from it. Bitcoin accumulation thrives in that space of clarity. There is also a subtle shift that occurs when accumulation becomes part of your routine. You stop viewing market downturns as tests of courage and start viewing them as natural phases. The urge to intervene diminishes. You are no longer trying to prove anything to yourself or to others. You are simply executing a plan that respects time. This is why trying to optimize entry points often backfires. Waiting for perfect prices introduces friction, It delays action and increases emotional involvement. Over time, it trains you to associate accumulation with anxiety rather than stability. Sustainable accumulation removes the need for precision. It accepts imperfection as a feature, not a bug. The goal is not to buy at the best possible price, but to achieve a meaningful position over many years. The irony is that this approach often produces better results anyway, because it avoids the behavioral traps that destroy returns. Missed entries, panic selling, overexposure, and burnout are far more damaging than suboptimal timing. Bitcoin does not punish imprecision, it punishes inconsistency. There's also the question of scale. Accumulating Bitcoin does not require dramatic gestures. Small, regular conversions matter more than occasional large ones driven by emotion. Over long periods, the compounding effect of steady accumulation becomes difficult to ignore. What once felt insignificant begins to feel substantial, not because of sudden price appreciation, but because ownership has quietly grown. This is where patience becomes tangible. You begin to notice that your sense of urgency fades. You stop feeling the need to explain yourself. The market can rise or fall, and your plan remains intact. This emotional neutrality is not indifference. It is confidence rooted in process rather than outcome. The most sustainable accumulation strategy, then, is one that you can follow during good times and bad times without renegotiating your identity each time the market moves. It does not require you to be brave. It requires you to be consistent. And consistency, when applied to a scarce asset with no dilution and no central control, has an almost unfair advantage over chaos. In the end, accumulating Bitcoin sustainably is less about financial engineering and more about self-knowledge. It is about designing a life where long-term thinking is possible, where patience is not constantly under attack, and where your actions are aligned with your understanding. Because the true enemy of accumulation is not volatility, it is exhaustion. At some point, if you accumulate Bitcoin long enough, something subtle changes. It stops feeling like a strategy and starts feeling like a statement. Not a statement you make loudly, but one you live quietly. The numbers on the screen still move, the headlines still rotate, but your relationship with them shifts. Bitcoin becomes less about what it might do for you and more about what it asks of you. Because accumulating Bitcoin is not a passive act. It shapes how you think about work, time, consumption, and responsibility. It forces you to confront questions most people avoid. What is my labor truly worth? How much of my life am I trading for money that slowly decays? What does it mean to store the product of my energy in something that cannot be diluted by someone else's decisions? These questions are uncomfortable, and they are transformative. When you choose to accumulate Bitcoin, you are choosing delayed gratification in a culture addicted to immediacy. You are choosing long-term stability over short-term approval. There are no likes for patience, no applause for restraint. In fact, more often than not, there is skepticism, ridicule, or polite dismissal. Bitcoin accumulation is rarely celebrated in its early stages because it looks indistinguishable from doing nothing. This is where many people fall away. Not because the idea stops making sense, but because the social cost becomes apparent. Friends talk about gains they made elsewhere. News cycles declare Bitcoin dead for the 100th time. Volatility returns, and with it, the familiar pressure to explain yourself. Why not sell? Why not wait? Why keep doing this? The answer, if it is honest, is rarely about price. It is about autonomy. Bitcoin introduces the concept of financial self-sovereignty in a way that no traditional asset does. Ownership is not abstract. It is not mediated through layers of permission. When you hold Bitcoin properly, you are not relying on anyone's promise. You are relying on mathematics, open source code, and a global network that does not know who you are and does not care. That realization changes how you view institutions. It does not necessarily make you hostile or distrustful, but it makes you discerning. You begin to see how deeply modern life depends on systems that require constant expansion to function. Debt, consumption, and growth are not presented as choices, but as defaults. Bitcoin offers a different rhythm, one that values conservation over acceleration. This rhythm seeps into daily life. People who accumulate Bitcoin often become more intentional with their spending, not out of fear, but out of respect for their own time. They start asking whether purchases align with their values or merely soothe temporary impulses. Accumulation naturally encourages simplicity, not as an ideology, but as a side effect of thinking in longer time horizons. There is also a quiet resilience that develops. When your sense of security is not entirely tied to systems you cannot control, you respond differently to uncertainty. Market crashes, policy changes, and economic shocks still matter, but they do not dominate your emotional landscape. You are less reactive, less panicked, less dependent on constant reassurance. This emotional stability is one of the most underappreciated benefits of long term Bitcoin accumulation. It does not make life easy, it makes it grounded. Of course, this path is not without doubt. There are moments when conviction feels thin, when volatility tests your resolve, when the future feels unclear. Accumulation does not eliminate uncertainty. It teaches you how to live with it without flinching. This is why accumulation is not about perfection. You will never accumulate at the best possible price. You will sometimes question your decisions. You will witness opportunities you did not take and feel the pull of hindsight. None of this disqualifies you. What matters is whether you continue to align your actions with your understanding. Over time, this alignment becomes its own reward. Bitcoin does not promise salvation. It does not guarantee outcomes. What it offers is a framework, a set of rules that do not change mid-game, and a chance to opt into a system where patience is not punished. In a world where almost everything feels unstable, that alone is extraordinary. The best way to accumulate Bitcoin, in the end, is not hidden in tactics or timing. It is found in becoming the kind of person who thinks long-term in a short-term world. Someone who values resilience over recognition, ownership over appearance, and conviction over comfort. Because Bitcoin does not change to accommodate you. You change to accommodate Bitcoin. And in that process, accumulation becomes more than a financial decision. It becomes a way of standing still while the world rushes past, holding something solid while everything else feels increasingly weightless.